conference. It gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Ken Boston, who was a member of the recent Commonwealth Review of the Funding for School, in other words, the Gonski Review. Prior to this, he's held positions of Chief Executive of the Qualifications Curriculum Authority in England between the years 2002 and 2008. He's Director General of Education and Training in New South Wales and Managing Director of TAFE from 1997 to 2002. Director General of School Education New South Wales from 1991 to 1997. Director General of Education in South Australia 1988 and 91, and General Manager of Education Planning and Policy in Victoria from 87 to 88. He's a Fellow of the Australian College of Education and a former President of the Australian College of Education. He was a Foundation Chair of the Curriculum Corporation, Chair of the Australian Education Council Committee for the Hobart Declaration on the National Goals of Schooling in 81, and a member of the Board of the Australian Council for Education Research. Dr. Boston is currently a member of the Australian Qualifications Framework Council and a member of the Board of Stewart House. More recently, he has been one of the Foundation members of the Need to Succeed Alliance, which has been supporting the Gonski campaign. And I want to add on behalf of the Federation that Dr. Boston has been tireless in supporting the Gonski recommendations and ensuring that they remain in the public eye. He's one member of that review that has not just finished with the review. He continues to be an advocate for the Gonski funding model. So can I ask you to put your hands together, please, and welcome Dr. Ken Boston.
What is Gonski? Gonski is a fundamental reimagining of the Australian education system. It is not just about money. At the heart of the Gonski model is a determination to bring all schools up to an agreed minimum resource standard, which just means that all schools will have the tools they need to do a good job for their students. The Australian schools that are already above the resource standard will still receive the base funding that will go to every school in Australia. They will not be penalised. But schools with less will get a little more. To bring all Australia's schools up to the resource standard, we will need both the federal and state governments to kick in. Because the federal government has more money than the states, the Gonski model requires 65% of funding from the federal government and 35% of funding from each of the states. Bringing every school in Australia up to standard is a big job, and that's why it will take a full 6 years to achieve. We also know there are many students in all sorts of schools who need extra help. The schools they go to will get a bit more money because those kids are more expensive to teach. Gonski is about creating a real meritocracy, where the success of every child, no matter the circumstances of their birth or the sort of school they attend, depends only on their individual ability and hard work. Gonski. It's what Australians call a fair go.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's really a very good piece of film, I think. And the wider that's seen and distributed, the better, because I do think it gets to the point of Gonski in a nutshell. In my remarks this afternoon, I want to begin at the heart of the matter, and that is why the neoconservative right that has taken control of the federal cabinet is so totally opposed to Gonski. It's not because of the budget or the state of the economy or because the Gonski solution won't work. It's because the two key Gonski objectives are both anathema to a neoconservative agenda. And those objectives are, first, to ensure that education as a public good is genuinely available to every child according to individual need, and secondly, to ensure that educational achievement as a positional good is available to all on the basis of ability and hard work alone. What is a public good? A public good is something that is universally available to all and accessible by all. Traffic signs, fire alarms, air traffic control, street lighting, and roads are common examples of a public good. The public good usually has a cost, which may vary according to circumstances. For example, the cost of bitumen roads as a public good in rural New South Wales is more than the cost per capita and per kilometre of roads in metropolitan Sydney. A public good is of benefit to all of us, and the benefit to each of us does not reduce the availability of the benefit to others. Now, by those criteria, education is a public good. Education is universally available in government and non-government schools. There's a cost to the taxpayer and in many schools to the parent in educating children. The cost of delivering education as a public good for some children will be more than the cost for other children because of circumstances such as disability, ethnicity, poverty, language background, or remoteness. The provision of education for all children is of benefit to all of us, and teaching one child to read does not reduce the availability of reading to another child. What is a positional good? A positional good is inherently scarce. It's a service or product with value arising from the fact that it's not available to everyone, so not all can benefit from it. Its possession confers status and preferment on the possessor. The economists' usual examples are luxury cars and houses, ocean cruises, and so on. An education credential, a higher school certificate, a TAFE certificate, a degree, a graduate diploma, a higher degree, is a positional good. By definition, high achievement in education is relative to the lower achievement of others. High educational outcomes confer status and preferment on the possessor. Now, the very essence of Gonski, the very guts of Gonski, is that it seeks to do two things. First, to ensure that every child, regardless of individual circumstances, receives the support needed to experience education as a public good. And that is a very different thing from every child receiving the same level of support. It's about ensuring every child is given the particular level and kind of support needed to ensure that he or she can gain full access to education as a public good. Secondly, Gonski seeks to ensure that educational achievement as a positional good is available on the basis of talent and hard work alone, rather than preferentially available to those in a position of wealth and privilege. It's absolutely vital to understand that Gonski is a fundamental reimagining of Australian education, not simply a proposal for allocating resources to schools. It's a radically liberal rethinking of priorities and approaches and objectives, not an exercise in accountancy. And Christopher Pyne understood that sooner than most people in this country, and he is utterly opposed to it. To explain the first of those objectives, to make education a genuine public good, I begin with the term teacher quality. We never talk of doctor quality or dentist quality. We talk of the quality of health care or the quality of oral health. And that quality varies greatly from place to place. Healthcare in Australia is not everywhere of the same quality. The variation is not explained by the quality of the medical staff, but by their number, the availability of specialist diagnosis and treatment, and the availability of technical and ancillary support. Low quality health care in rural and remote Australia is explained by inadequate funding for the task at hand, not by the relative incompetence of the available doctors and nurses. Now, it's the same with teaching. The national discourse should not be about teacher quality, but about quality of education. The teachers in our most disadvantaged schools are at least as good as those in our most advantaged schools. The issue is not their competence, skill or commitment. The issue is that their number, resources and support are unequal to the task. At a national level, there is no correlation between teacher quality and school performance in Australia. There are some ineffective teachers, as there are incompetent doctors, but they can be found in schools both effective and ineffective, and their procedures for dealing with them. But education in Australia is not everywhere of the same quality. There is great variation from school to school, and it is that which Gonski seeks to address. The schools at the lower end of our scale, or both the scale of aggregated social disadvantage and the scale of educational performance, are, in my view, the emergency wards of Australian education. In a hospital emergency ward, there's a battery of medical specialists and intervention techniques and diagnostic tools targeted at the recovery of the individual. A school with more than 90% of its intake being children with a language background other than English, from families from 35 different language groups, less than 3 years in the school, less than 3 years in the country, and unlikely to stay more than 3 years in the school, is an emergency ward in the same real sense. So too is a small rural school taking children from the long-term unemployed, some perhaps suffering from fetal alcohol syndrome, some of whom have never been read to or even held a book. And that image needs to be implanted firmly in the public mind. Children entering such schools require immediate diagnosis of need and immediate intensive care. They need smaller class sizes, the ready availability of Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions delivered by fully qualified personnel, speech therapists, counsellors, school family liaison officers, including interpreters, and a range of other support. A child is 8 years of age once in her life. If she's not learned to read to the level of national minimum standard by the end of Year 3, she will not effectively read to learn in later years. It's in the public interest that we invest in her education as a public good. And if a refugee child newly arrived in this country, not speaking English and from a very poor family, requires greater support than the child of a third-generation Australian family in secure employment with an income twice the national average, then so be it. We have for years accepted such needs-based differentials in the cost of our road system and in the provision of many other kinds of public good. If we fail to make that investment, we consign that child and thousands of others to the bin of underachievement, and we fail as a nation to realise our potential stock of human capital. The Business Council of Australia, certainly not a neoconservative body, but hardly socialist left, estimates that a 10% increase in the number of young children completing Year 12 would increase GDP by 1.8 billion by 2020. The Grattan Institute estimates that increasing our international test scores by one standard deviation would lift GDP growth by 1%. Now, over the past 40 years, and particularly since the Howard governments, successive governments have allocated funding to the three sectors after consultation with state governments, independent school organisations, church leaders, teacher unions and others. And it's never been on the basis of the detailed assessment of the needs of individual schools. It's been essentially a political settlement, sector-based and needs-blind. There's then been a series of post hoc equity programs designed to address specific purposes, the most recent of which was the new partnership funding. And those programs have been but partially effective and time limited. Now, it is critical to understand that the Gonski model turns all that absolutely on its head. The Gonski model is sector blind and needs-based. It seeks to assess the resource requirements of each individual school according to need. It proposes, as you know, a base loading for all schools and loadings for the different elements of aggregated social disadvantage. It brings equity funding into the mainstream. And what is eventually spent in the Catholic sector, the independent sector and the government sector is to be the sum of the needs of the schools in that sector, built up from the bottom, not the result of a political settlement done behind closed doors with cardinals and others and pushed downwards from the top. Now, the Labor government, not Gonski, said no school should lose $1, and to satisfy that requirement, we included in the model a base grant for all schools. But there is no doubt that the model is redistributive and that it creates a more even, not totally, but a more even playing field across the three sectors. Christopher Pyne understood that sooner than most people in politics. And unlike some people in the coalition parties, he's utterly opposed to it. The Abbott government might claim the nation can't afford an increase in education funding. What Pyne is really opposed to is the redistribution of whatever funding might be available according to measured need. Now, the second Gonski objective is one of equal opportunity, to ensure that educational achievement as a positional good is earned on the basis of talent and hard work alone, rather than purchased by those in a position of wealth and privilege. The strategic targeting of resources according to need, which is what we're proposing in Gonski, will do much more than reduce the impact of disadvantage on educational outcomes. The important flip side is that it will also reduce the impact of advantage and privilege on educational outcomes. If school performance is neither advantaged nor disadvantaged by parental income, ethnic background, religion, school size and location, or whether a student attends an independent Catholic or public school, success at school will be determined essentially by the student's ability, application, and hard work. In other words, Gonski will create a genuine meritocracy. And that's where Minister Pyne, although by no means all other members of his party, has particular difficulty with Gonski. Mr. Pyne is anchored still in the era of Dr. Kemp, the minister in the Howard government, who presided over increased funding for non-government schools in order to underwrite financially the exercise of choice between government and non-government schools by parents. And as many of us predicted at that time, including the leaders of your union, this has not resulted in reduced fees and greater accessibility to the government sector, but has widened the gulf between the rich and the poor. It sucked the oxygen from any real competition between schools in different sectors. And as the international data clearly demonstrate, Australia's educational performance has sharply deteriorated since that time. The publicly funded user choice model introduced by Dr. Kemp was intended to encourage increasing numbers of parents to pay for their children's education. And to do so, non-government schools had to be perceived as manifestly better than state schools. If parents are to invest in their child's education, they want to see a return on the investment. And the return they want is educational achievement as a positional good, to increase their child's chances for selection into courses such as law, medicine, or engineering in the university of their choice. At present, the hard-working and talented children of the privileged have a somewhat better prospect of access to the very highest levels of educational achievement than the similarly hard-working and talented children of the disadvantaged. Gonski aims to change all that. All won't have prizes. This is about equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes. But those who do receive prizes will do so on the basis of hard work, application, and ability alone. Now, Mr. Pyne correctly understands that as a direct challenge to the neoconservative heartland. A funding system designed to build a genuine meritocracy by creating an even playing field and devaluing the benefits of private schooling cannot be contemplated by the clique currently in charge in Canberra. So, what is to be done? I have 5 thoughts about this. You will have many others, but let me just suggest 5 things to you. First, I think we should heed the advice of Justice Michael Kirby at the recent awards night for the Centre for Public Education here in the Town Hall, that the priority is again to make the case for the Gonski reform to the Australian electorate. This the previous government failed to do adequately. Indeed, its failure to accept the Gonski recommendation to establish a national schools resourcing body, like a schools commission, largely unpicked the broad-based national consensus which we built up by the Gonski process over a period of 19 months. The objective should be to elect a pro-Gonski government at the next election, either coalition or Labor. I am personally immensely encouraged by State governments, including Liberal National Party governments, and most prominently in New South Wales, which are committed to the Gonski principles, are prepared to stand for 6 years and are prepared to bear the cost of the implementation. And such support, together with support from state opposition parties and some federal government backbenchers, does bring real pressure on the present federal government leadership. There also seems to me, from the various discussions I've had around the country following presentations on Gonski, substantial potential to build support among the more disadvantaged non-government schools and their parents, and within those many elements of the Catholic sector in which there is a strong Catholic social justice perspective. I'm also encouraged by the strong interest that I've experienced from business and industry groups, which clearly recognise the importance of education to the economy, understand the imperative of maximising our national stock of human capital, and understand the loss we are accruing as a result of not giving full education as a public good to every child. Nothing the federal government has done or said it will do or can do other than implement needs-based funding will further prevent the decline in our national performance in the next round of PISA results in 2015, which will become available in the first part of 2016. Those results, which everyone seems to put so much store on, will continue to deteriorate. Barring a double dissolution, the first date at which the next election for the House and half Senate can be held is 6th of August 2016. We will go into that election with Gonski well and truly back on the agenda. Second, we must be very careful not to be distracted by the diversionary and flanking attacks on Gonski launched by Minister Pyne under the banner of the Students First program and its 4 pillars of teacher quality, school autonomy, parental engagement, and a robust curriculum. Our poor international performance and steep social gradient cannot be explained away by poor teacher quality, and I've already referred to my preference for talking about quality of education. But I guess if every teacher in New South Wales were to obtain a master's degree within the next 3 years, there might be some improvement in performance across the range, including at the top and the bottom of the range. But the gap between the most disadvantaged state school and the most affluent private school will never be reduced without the strategic redistribution of funding according to measured need. So, improved teacher quality, or as I would prefer to describe it, improvement in the quality of education, costs money. It is not an alternative to Gonski. Gonski is an essential precondition. Now, as the research has shown, the second pillar, school autonomy, is an irrelevant distraction. I worked in England for 9 years, where every government school, that is, maintained school, which includes faith-based schools, has the autonomy of the independent public schools in Western Australia, governing boards that can hire and fire head teachers and staff, determine salaries and promotions, and so on. Yet school performance in England varies enormously from school to school and from region to region, and essentially it is related to aggregated social advantage in the home counties and the south of the country and disadvantage in the north. It is the quality of the whole school instructional leadership of the principal that is the important thing, not their capacity to hire staff or borrow money for capital works. And building high-quality instructional leadership across a school system costs money. It is also not an alternative to Gonski. Gonski is the prerequisite. Pine's third pillar, parental engagement, is critical to school improvement. But building effective engagement, for example, with newly arrived communities from different language and cultural backgrounds, demands very substantial resourcing. Improved parental engagement is not a substitute for Gonski. It requires Gonski if it's to be effective. And the fourth pillar, a robust curriculum, is code for the charge that our poor international performance is the result of a cultural left national curriculum. Now, no one would be opposed, I think, to ongoing monitoring and review of the curriculum by the proper authority, which is the Ministerial Council, not the Commonwealth Ministers, and by independent reviewers. But this is not what we've got. In the next few months, Minister Pine will focus on an allegedly content-free, left-wing and insufficiently Anglophile curriculum as the cause of our national decline. To Pine, education is a matter of filling an empty vessel rather than the Socratic vision of lighting a flame. The issue is, my point is, we must not be distracted by this. The real issue is Gonski. Consider the gap in reading performance between the top 20% of Year 9 students, who are mainly in affluent schools, and the bottom 20%, who are mainly in disadvantaged schools, is currently equivalent to 5 years of schooling. It's an appalling situation. 1 in 5 of our 15-year-olds is reading at no better than mid-primary level. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is not the result of insufficient autonomy for government schools and their principals. It is not the result of poor teaching. It is not the result of a cultural left curriculum. It is not the result of failing to make Thomas Hardy compulsory reading in Year 8. It's the direct result of sector-based needs-blind funding, and it will not change until the situation is reversed and funding becomes sector-blind and needs-based. Third, we must have, all of us individually, all the arguments at hand to counter in meetings with parents, in the local media, in the local pub, in meetings such as Rotary, which principals are so often called upon to address, the fallacious and frequently dishonest assertions made in the media. Despite neoconservative assertions that there is no evidence that increased expenditure will improve school performance, the positive impact of increased funding on student and school performance is overwhelmingly reported in the scholarly literature. The jury is in on this. The relationship between socioeconomic status and achievement is also absolutely beyond question. This is true however socioeconomic status might be defined, either narrowly as parental occupation and income, or more broadly as the Index of Economic, Social and Cultural Status, which is used by PISA and which includes parental occupation, parental education attainment, and home possessions relating to wealth, educational resources and cultural possessions, or more broadly as aggregated social disadvantage, which is the measure we used in the Gonski report and included additionally indigeneity, language proficiency and geographic location. Again, the jury is in on this. Briefings prepared by the Teachers Federation and the AEU are invaluable in assisting you to respond to fallacy with fact. I would also recommend that you look at some of the submissions, transcripts of evidence, and answers to questions on notice, which are now available on the website of the Senate Select Committee on School Funding. And for example, answers to questions on notice number 41, which is in my name, is a comprehensive survey of the research findings on the relationship between expenditure, socioeconomic status, and performance. It's in my name because I was the one answering the questions, but 12 of us worked for 3 weeks preparing that document, and it is well worth a read. It will give you chapter and verse on the literature on each of those issues. The point I'm making is that we each individually cannot afford to let the nonsense go unchallenged at any level, from the Murdoch press and 2UE down to a dinner table conversation or a chat with a parent, if we are to turn things around at the next election. My fourth point is to keep the pressure on the Labor Party. They have a lot to answer for. I admire Gillard for establishing the Gonski process. But the reason we don't have Gonski today is not because the country has elected an Abbott government, but because the Labor government wasted 20 months and failed in the implementation. Nine months after the election, there is no roadmap apart from a promise to fund the full 6 years. I do not understand why the opposition does not commit to setting up a national schools resourcing body, like a schools commission, as we recommended, which would be immensely attractive to the states and territories, and which would provide a sound basis for implementing needs-based funding once it returns to government, rather than the schmozzle we have at the moment. And finally, whoever forms the next government, a rejuvenated Labor Party or a nicer group of Liberals, let's campaign to get rid of what proved to be the albatross around the neck of the Gonski panel, and that is the undertaking that no school should lose a dollar. Now, I'm not suggesting that we bring to an end state aid to non-government schools. That's part of now a national dispensation. But I do take up David Gonski's comment in his recent Blackburn oration, and I do believe that it's in the interests of the nation and the individual that whatever funding is available, particularly if times are as tight as it's said they are, whatever funding is available should be spent strategically on the schools that need it, government and non-government, and on the things that matter, rather than on the schools that don't need it and on the things that are simply nice to have. For example, the capacity to service a loan to build a new boathouse is an obscenity, in my view, when we look at what's happening in some of the In conclusion, Gonski lives, and ensuring that is so, great credit must be given to the AEU, the New South Wales Teachers Federation, the teacher unions in other states, and to you as members of the Federation in your individual schools for your highly successful national campaign to keep this issue at the forefront of the public mind. Without that campaign, which we need to continue, obviously, through to the next election, I believe the neoconservative right would have swept away the Gonski agenda. The I Give a Gonski campaign was immensely powerful and immensely successful. Gonski remains. I firmly believe that needs-based funding along the lines of the Gonski Model will eventually be introduced to this country. The longer the delay, the greater the deterioration and injustice. But at some stage there will be a national government that will be prepared to act to prevent Australian education going utterly to the dogs. It's been a privilege to speak with you. I thank you and I wish you well.